and welcome to episode 5 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. Today, we have Kyle Stanford on the podcast. Kyle is professor and chair in logic and philosophy of science at the University of California at Irvine. Kyle's research is centrally concerned with what we know and how do we know it, especially in science. His interest in these questions has taken him into a wide range of fields of philosophy, including the philosophy of biology, the history of modern philosophy, especially the writings of Locke and Hume, and the philosophy of language. Much of his recent work is focused, however, on questions surrounding scientific realism, the widespread view that our best scientific theories offer descriptions of otherwise inaccessible domains of nature that are at least probably and or approximately true. In his book, Exceeding Our Grasp, Kyle argued that the most serious challenge to the view of scientific realism is posed by what he calls the problem of unconceived alternatives. This problem arises because we choose from among competing fundamental scientific theories the one that offers the best explanation of the available evidence as the one in which our credence will be invested. But the historical record of scientific inquiry itself reveals that we routinely fail to conceive of all the theoretical possibilities that are well confirmed by the evidence available to us before we do so, including alternative possibilities that will ultimately replace the one we have accepted on the strength of that evidence. So this historical pattern constitutes the best reason we have, Kyle suggests, to believe that there are probably fundamentally distinct alternatives to even the best contemporary scientific theories that are also well confirmed by the evidence we now have, including some that will ultimately replace contemporary theories in the course of further inquiry, but that nonetheless remain unconceived by scientists and scientific communities of the present day. So Kyle suggests that the central remaining question concerns just where and when this problem should and should not lead us to regard fundamental scientific theories simply as powerful instruments for mediating our interactions with otherwise inaccessible domains of nature, rather than literally accurate descriptions of such domains. So in this connection, he has recently argued, and this is something we get to talk about on the podcast, that specific features of the institutional context and incentive structure of modern professionalized science may render us even more vulnerable to this problem of unconceived alternatives than were scientific communities of the past. But the problem does not pose an equally significant challenge to theorizing necessarily in all scientific fields or for every sort of scientific research. So that's a little bit about Kyle and his recent work. Kyle was a pleasure to chat with, very enjoyable. I think he's a tremendous amount to offer the philosophy of science community. And without further ado, let's go talk to Kyle. So where'd you grow up, Kyle?
So when I was very young, I grew up internationally in Europe and South America. My dad worked for Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals in the international division, and so we moved around about every 3 years. But by the time I was 11, we moved back to Indianapolis, which is home base for Lilly. So I was there through the rest of high school and stuff like that before going off to college in Indianapolis. So I've been to Bloomington many times, actually.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry to have to say, I might have missed a conference you were speaking at. Did you speak at a realism conference?
I did, so that wasn't at IU, but it was at Purdue.
Okay.
It was at IUPUI.
IUPUI, which it would be in Indy.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, I did. I flew back for that. It was actually fun to see Indy.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'm glad you... Was it a good conference?
Yes, really good. That was so Tim Lyons, and I think Peter Vickers maybe was involved in putting that on too, and it was very successful.
Okay, great. So growing up, you grew up international. Whereabouts internationally?
So when I was 2, we moved to Dusseldorf, Germany. When I was 5, we moved to Grinzing, Austria, which is right outside of Vienna. And when I was 8, we moved to São Paulo, Brazil.
Wow. Do you speak German and Portuguese?
no and no.
Yeah.
But what I do find is in situations where I can pick it up, it's much easier to pick up. But if I'm just starting cold, I can't. I learned a little bit of German just through the profession more than anything else. But I can't just start reeling off Portuguese or German very easily.
Sure. So you picked it up. Can you still understand it a little bit, or not?
Again, German, yes, and Portuguese, no, in part because I have, repeated, although limited exposure to German, and you just don't run into people who speak Portuguese very often.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So growing up, what were you interested in growing up? Were you interested in the sciences, philosophy, anything else other than philosophy, science?
I was kind of an all-around interested academic kid growing up. I was pretty bookish, but I didn't really have favorite academic subjects. I really enjoyed them all. In fact, I probably did more history and literature growing up than by the time I got to high school, I was pretty science intensive. But
okay, so was there a particular historical period you were interested in, or was it just all history?
No, I love history. Speaking things historically, that sounds weird, but it's true.
Yeah,
and also literature. So,
okay. What kind of literature?
Oh, it's just, we're talking about an age where it was young enough that meant what that meant is I really loved English class and really, not only got a lot out of reading literary classics in class, then would go on and do more reading on my own and stuff like that because I was moved by the process.
Very nice. Was there, at that time when you were thinking about what you wanted to do when you got older, was an author in the works? Was there something to do with writing?
Did not expect that at all. I was a go-getter, and I had a pretty well laid out plan whereby I was going to, my plan was to go to college and major in history, and then probably, in all likelihood, go on to law school from there and become an attorney.
Oh.
Yeah. I wanted to be a public service attorney, either a DA or a public defender.
Wow. Okay. So was this toward the end of high school that you came to this particular idea, or? So,
yeah, last couple years of high school, but also it's what I went off to college thinking I would do. That was really a product of two things. One is I really enjoyed I really enjoyed the courses and teachers that I had in history, and I was really I was enthusiastic about the idea of what lawyers did. As I learned more about what was required, I seemed like it was more and more a good fit for me. And but I was also very concerned that whatever I do professionally, I had the sense that there were a lot of different things I could do, and I wanted. It was important to me to make the thing I did for a living an investment in public service of some kind.
That's great. Is this something? Is this an ethic or moral ideal that is this something that your parents instilled, or is this something you picked up along the way?
I think I think I grew up feeling lucky.
Okay.
That I'd enjoyed a lot of advantages that lots of other people hadn't, and I don't.
What kind of advantages? What?
We were wealthy enough to live internationally and
moving around,
and I also had a very stable family and parents who were genuinely and unselfishly cared about my welfare and would do anything to further serve either my brothers or my education. And so I figured out, I felt like I had a lot of breaks coming up or growing up.
Yeah.
And that gave me the feeling that really I had a kind of moral obligation to give back. And since I'd had so many advantages, to do something with my life that helped other people.
Yeah. Was there a time, I don't know, growing up where you was there like an experience that you found helping people either felt good or was there, can you recall the time where you really started thinking, this idea really came to fruition and you were thinking, this is public service, doing something for others is something that I really want to do?
I wouldn't say, it's not like there's a big story or a big incident where that's when I decided that. It kind of grew slowly, I think. But it was something that stuck with me for a while. One of my big concerns about going into academics professionally and philosophy professionally was I was worried about whether I'd really be satisfying that ambition. And I eventually made my peace with that. But it was, that was still a really active part of my thinking at the time by the time I was going off to graduate school.
I think, the idea of what kind of a public service does this kind of work do? I think, I would love to come back to that question. It'd be interesting to see exactly what you mean by making peace with that, and maybe what you think about it. There,
I can tell you. So, in my first year of graduate school, I was having I was successful, but I was getting worried about whether the work I was doing and the work that was going on around me really mattered to anybody's life or changing anything. And ultimately I decided there's an unusual and nice feature of a philosophical career, hard to reproduce elsewhere. It's true that you're not helping other people in the, here's a particular other person in a terrible circumstance, and I will help them get out of it, and then let me go find another one.
Sure.
Kind of way. But it seemed to me there were professional academics had this nice feature where, look, all of us want to be famous for having changed the thinking of the, Western civilization, I guess.
Yeah.
In some profound way. It's not reasonable to expect that you're going to be able to do that, but you're at least taking, right, in the research that you do, in the professional work that you do, you're at least making that possible, or making room for that if it's a possibility. In the meantime, you have this, what I think of as this great safety suit, because you can positively influence the world, in the sort of one person at a time way through your teaching. So I felt like when I describe myself as having made my peace with it, I think I had, initially this picture of the kind of, swooping in to make everything better kind of public service. And ultimately I realized that, academic work in philosophy of science is probably not going to be like that. But notice these other things, especially this kind of safety suit where, you can make the world a better place by teaching one student at a time and student at a time. And I get to do that anyway while I'm trying to, advance professionally in other ways. So that seemed like a good system to me.
Absolutely. So I'm very interested to figure out how you did that and what it's like. Let's take a step a little bit further back, just one moment. So you were interested. You said you had a turn into high school where you started becoming interested in the sciences. How did that come about?
Well, it wasn't really a discontinuity. It was something that as with all academic subjects, I really enjoyed.
You liked history. You also liked science.
I love science. Yeah. It was really in high school. I went to a large and very successful high school in Indianapolis, a public high school.
Oh, which high school?
North Central.
Okay. I think I've heard. I've had a few students of my own that have.
It wouldn't be too surprising because it's a very large high school.
Okay.
And then the opportunities to take different kinds of science courses and deepen, my understanding of science just sort of flowered at that point. And so it was when we hit high school, there were, separate multiple courses in biology, physics, chemistry. And then I started doing things like the Science Olympiad as extracurricular activities. And academic decathlon involved a little bit of science too, but Science Olympiad was obviously science heavy. And so that's the kind of flowering that I mean. There were just there were many more opportunities to do to study various parts of science and to do them in a more serious way once I got to high school.
Okay, and so taking that, you found your way into undergrad. So how did undergrad go for you?
Undergrad was great. So I went to Northwestern.
Oh, great!
Outside of Chicago, and
so a little close to home, but not too far. Far enough away.
A few hours by car. Mm-hmm. And I amassed a considerable amount of AP credit in high school, and so I went off to college with enough credit. Like I started as if it were the middle of my sophomore year when I got there, in terms of the amount of course credit I had. Mm-hmm. And so I decided, I regret this in some ways, but I decided partly to give myself a challenge that I was going to get through college in 3 years. And I did that. I went in planning on, as I said, majoring in history, and preparing for law. I came out double majoring in philosophy and psychology.
You did psychology as well. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Very nice. So what was it? How did your, I imagine if you're thinking about going into history, you probably have to take some history classes, maybe your first or second year. How did you find your way over into the philosophy and psychology departments?
Well, so it's interesting. I would say that this kind of started before any collegiate level experience with history. So the as with many campuses, freshmen arrive in the fall, and then there's a special process whereby they go sign up for classes, mostly in the things that there's still room left in. And I went off with the intention of doing history, but at that process, I started looking, and the class, it honestly kind of blew me away that there were courses about things like the meaning of life and knowledge and stuff like that. And so Northwestern's on a quarter system, but for my first quarter, right after I got there, I'd signed up for 3 of the 4 courses I was taking were philosophy courses. And so I think a big part of that was, kind of like the stepping up in weight class going to high school, going to college and encountering other people who took philosophical kinds of questions very, very seriously, and that thinking seriously about them repaid the effort and stuff like that. And so I didn't come from an academic family or anything. So the idea that people would do what I do for a living was kind of foreign, right?
Pay attention to these and continue to think about these ideas over and over.
Right. And so it was, the most important thing was just becoming aware that there was an academic field in which people did this sort of thing. Didn't worry about narrowly practical, I love lots of other academic fields too, but that there was a field where people did the kind of thing that they do in philosophy.
Yeah.
And then as I started taking classes and stuff, I discovered my sense was that my history courses were they were labor intensive, but I want to say this carefully, I guess, but their engagement with the material seemed to me shallow in comparison with philosophy courses.
Okay, yeah, and you're speaking in particular with the courses with which you took. Yeah, and sure.
I had a Plato and Aristotle course as one of that first quarter, and it took me forever to read the 30 pages of Plato we had to read for each class meeting or whatever. But the actual practice of doing it and figuring it out, I found immensely not just enjoyable, but intellectually stimulating. And so I had started to have this experience in a lot of different philosophy courses, and eventually decided that was more my cup of tea. Psychology was in part, my interest in it was in part because I was interested in the mind, right? So a lot of my interest in psychology at that time.
Yeah. So what kinds of questions were you interested in at that time?
It's almost embarrassing to say.
It's fine. I understand. It's 20-year-old questions. I think we've all had them.
Really big ones.
Yeah.
Can we? Skepticism, global or radical skepticism, bothered me immensely for a couple of years in college. I read the Meditations and Hume's Enquiry and various forms of radical skepticism, and whether or not there was, we could escape from them, absolutely captivated me. And in a way that early, the things that really got to me were epistemological questions, and that's never really gone away. So it's also why in my first philosophy of science course, which I think was in that first quarter, I was just blown away by, really for the first time in my life, being exposed to the idea or the possibility that, our best scientific theories weren't just telling us what things were like.
Yeah. When that happens, it's a pretty eye-opening.
Well, it was for me. I was a little frustrated with it, with everybody else in the class. There was like a small group of us who were taking that idea very seriously, and most people seem to have I can't tell you what it is, but there's got to be something wrong with right with any argument that shows that claims to show our best scientific theories aren't just accurate descriptions of the way the world is.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, I have a fellow graduate student who Evan Arnett, who teaches basic scientific reasoning, and one of the things he does in his classes with the human biology majors is challenges just whether and how you can justify whether the Earth goes around the sun. And just based on empirical evidence, and then understanding how Copernicus proposed some of these ideas, but it's to most students it's just like obvious. Of course, this is just like an easy description. We
worth thinking through.
Not even worth thinking through. It was obvious that people in the past, they saw one way, and then we saw the truth, and this is how it goes. And it's he's explaining frustration of some students will take it on, and some students won't. But yeah, I can imagine you were one of those students who struggled with those kinds of questions.
Well, I saw the force of the argumentative considerations in favor. Same thing, you can imagine the same kind of thing happening with global skepticism, right? It's just not that high a proportion of undergraduate students can you get to be really, really worried, like stay up late at night worried about the kind of problem and what the appropriate response would be. But I really was. And so, this is common in philosophy courses, especially philosophy courses which lots of people are taking because they satisfy a requirement or for some other reason, but then because they're super interested. There's a kind of vague sense among many of the students in a course like that okay, they're not smart. Okay, I'm not smart enough to tell you what the response to that argument about underdetermination is or whatever, but you're not actually worrying me about the status of the things I know and so on.
Sure.
And I didn't have that, right? I took it seriously.
Yeah. And so with some of the epistemological questions, and then relating, I imagine, philosophy of mind.
Although part of my reason for for the second major in psychology, part of the reasons for that were instrumental.
Sure.
I knew a fair bit of psychology just because I found it interesting. And so, knew some about it. I had, there were courses I was going to take anyway to satisfy campus-wide breadth requirements that would count towards a psychology major. And since I was trying to get through college in only 3 years, I enjoyed making it a bigger challenge by trying to do 2 majors as well.
Sure. Yeah, that is something. I recall the excitement somewhat of challenging yourself. It seems like a lot, some of the brighter students were taking on 2 majors, math and English or something like that. And
make no mistake, I was pretty impressed with myself at this
Oh, yeah.
I not only wanted to challenge myself, but I also probably was motivated by everybody else knowing just how clever and smart and hardworking I was.
Of course. All right. So you studied and then ended up, so how did you got more and more interested in this, was the public defender, slowly fading into the background, or was this some strong consideration of law school after undergrad?
There was strong consideration of law school, especially because, my big shift was to philosophy, but that was also an extraordinarily good preparation for law school.
Oh, sure,
so
yeah.
I thought that's what I was still doing, was in the pre-law kind of, mold. And essentially what happened a little bit at a time was I learned even more about what lawyers actually do, and so it's not that, every day isn't Perry Mason that started to seem less enthusiastic. It was more things like, well, when you're a lawyer, you don't try to figure out what's true. You have an obligation to represent a certain side of a case, and you're just doing that as well as you can. And stuff like that started to look less appealing to me. But much more important, I think, was just getting to know, in the later years of college, getting to know the faculty, the philosophy faculty at Northwestern, as individuals, and it sort of blew my mind that, wow, a grown-up can do that for a living, right? The idea of reading and teaching and thinking about and writing about whatever you wanted had not yet occurred to me as a thing that one could get paid to do.
Sure. Yeah.
So when I saw there were real people, and I actually really enjoyed interacting with them, and they seemed really smart, and that's what they did for a living, that started to get very attractive to me. And then, so I slowly worked my way over to the idea, but I was still, in my last year of college, when I was applying for to graduate programs and stuff like that. I guess maybe. Yeah, no, in my last year, sorry, I'd already gotten an NSF fellowship and
were you a GRFP fellow?
That's right.
Very nice, very nice.
It was.
Oh, yeah.
I'd already had that, but I guess it was probably in that middle year where I was really torn about whether that, it to somebody with my background, and certainly to my parents, right, going off to be a professional philosopher sounded like deciding to make a career out of rock and roll or something like that.
Sure.
And so that took some adjustment. But, eventually, so it was deciding to do it was a matter of just getting up the courage to give something a try that I didn't know much about. And it wasn't a safe professional future in the same way that law would have been.
Sure, sure. So you applied, and I see made it over to UCSD.
That is right.
That's great. Yeah. And so, how was that?
That was great. In part, I asked Northwestern faculty for a lot of guidance on, where would be the right kind of place to go to graduate school, and I wound up at UCSD in part because they had very strong philosophy of science.
Mm-hmm. Did they have the science studies program at the time?
They did. It was very new, and I did go into it, but I wasn't sure. I made part of my negotiations with the university were that I wanted to make sure that I could just bail out and go to the philosophy department full time if I wanted to, because I wasn't sure how I felt about science studies, and I didn't know an awful lot about it until I got there. Mm-hmm. But the things that that wasn't really a big attraction of the place, except for the fact that I knew the science studies program had a bunch of money, so their students didn't struggle for support. But so I had read one of Philip Kitcher's books in undergrad, mm-hmm. and found it amazingly worthwhile. It was Abusing Science, Abusing Science, the case against creationism.
Okay, yeah.
And so I was very excited to meet him, and really,
and he was at the time. He was there at the time, correct?
That's right. Yeah. He wound up leaving like a year or two after I was done, so that would have been right around the turn of the century.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah. Were you there at the same time of David Danks?
I overlapped with David just a little bit, but it was like I was already far enough into the dissertation writing stage that I didn't really get to know him at all.
Connect. Yeah, sure. Okay,
better now, but yeah, no, it was we technically overlapped, but didn't really interact. But the other thing was that the UCSD philosophy department seemed like a really mellow group of people who were interested in they enjoyed each other as much as they enjoyed hardcore philosophy, but they did both things. And so part of I remember being on the telephone with Arthur Fine, who was back at Northwestern at the time, saying to him, wow, I think this. I was during my UCSD visit, and I was saying, this seems like such a great place. I would really, I think I would really enjoy graduate school here, but I know that Pittsburgh is a more highly ranked department and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Should I? To his credit, he gave me the advice that the far more important than anything else was how much you liked being in graduate school at the place you were in graduate school, and enjoyed the people and the activity. And so that gave me a kind of freedom that I don't think I would have had otherwise to say, well, yeah, you know what, UCSD is where I really want to be. I like these people and the kinds of things that they're worried about and the ways in which they worry about them. And I never regretted that decision. I had a great cohort of graduate students at UCSD, and true to my initial impressions, we had week basketball, a pickup basketball game, and poker games, and it was a real community.
Nice.
Graduate students at the time.
That's great. So, can you recall any other folks who you went to graduate school with?
Oh, sure. So let's see. People whose names you might know now would include people like Bruce Gleamore, Jessica Pfeiffer, Jillian Barker, who else? Andrew Wayne. There were quite a few. Jonathan Gunderson was more in epistemology and philosophy of science, but Oran Shagrir. So there were, Brian Keeley. Lots of the UCSD cohort, mine and those around me. Lots of people who have gone on to Laura Perini. Lots have gone on to professional success from that program. Yeah.
Did you get to teach when you were in graduate school?
I did. My last year, I was super nervous about it.
Can I understand? Yeah.
But partly for parceling out department support reasons, and I'd had so much support already, both from the Science Studies program and from the NSF. They wanted me to, and I wanted the experience too. So anyway, so I taught a course essentially in early modern empiricism. Well, actually, I guess it went locked through. We did a couple weeks on Kant at the end.
Okay.
Prolegomena. So empiricist modern philosophy and its aftermath, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I did that in my last year.
Okay. How'd the course go?
Really well, except for me being so nervous about
Nervous
it.
all the time. Yeah.
So I mean, this is surely par for the course, but
Sure.
I did try to do at least one thing that it's funny because the students, weren't that different from my own age and stuff like that. But they were really enthusiastic and they were really rooting for me.
Sure.
And they wure also willing to be honest with me. So I checked with them, and I did try to explain at least one thing that they just had no hope of understanding. I think it was in context the early modern empiricist theory of ideas. It was the difference between content and the vehicles of content.
Oh, okay.
And so I tried to use this example from Frege, and that didn't go well. But I mean, it was funny though. They frankly and happily told me, confessed to me, they had no idea what I was talking about, and I decided to 86 that.
That's great. I love that transparency of just honesty. Like I'm sorry, but we have no idea what's going on.
Bad idea. Let's not worry about summarize, bottom line it.
Sure.
Moved on to something else that would work. So as I think almost everybody does when they first start teaching, I made the course content a little too hard.
Sure.
But that didn't turn out to hurt anybody.
Yeah. So you have a good time. It sounds like a great community was built up, and which I think is great. And so coming along, your dissertation. What was I see? Was it a pragmatic account? What was your dissertation again?
So it's not really philosophy of science. Interestingly enough,
okay.
When I got around, it's funny because the realism issue, as I described a bit ago, realism issue really drew me in to, really blew my mind, really got me worrying. I said, well, how do we know? Should we believe that those things? But then when I went off to graduate school, I wanted to get broader. I wanted to cover more of the, I'd taken a lot of philosophy of science at Northwestern, and that department at the time was idiosyncratic in a number of ways. And so I went off to graduate school looking to become more general. And when I got around to thinking about what I wanted to write about as for a dissertation, I realized that the philosophical mystery that had always kind of puzzled me the most and been most resistant to my efforts to sort it out was on the nature of causation. And so I wrote a dissertation that I'm still pretty happy with, although I haven't published it anywhere or anything like that. Articulating essential. So it was a very much more sophisticated sort of Humean and Kantian story about what causation is.
Oh, really?
Tied more closely than anybody in the modern period did to the kinds of creatures that we have and the practical constraints and needs we have in our lives. So the big, this is more than you wanted to know, but the big
no, this is interesting. No, yeah.
Of the dissertation was so it's something like constant conjunction. It's an extensional pattern in the world, but it's more sophisticated than that. The connections and successions that we regard as causal ones are ones that take place in accord with this kind of idealized, the most efficient and effective set of rules we would need for predicting and intervening in the world around us, right? So it was similar, very similar in spirit to something I didn't know about yet, which was the best system analyses of laws and that kind of thing, right? The idea being oh yeah, well, this is a construction on our part because it's a matter of what kinds of rules we need to use. But that the contribution of the world was not, special magic glue that we learn how to refer to or anything like that, but was just patterns of succession among events in the world.
Sure. And you said you didn't get around to publishing it?
No, I tried. So I've published parts of it. Like the first chapter was on Hume, and that chapter come out and stuff like that. But but the whole thing was very book-like, and my dissertation committee was very enthusiastic about encouraging me to try to turn it into a book.
Sure.
I had an article-length version of the big story that went to a bunch of places, and who were encouraging, but didn't work. And then I got some referee comments, some challenges from Philosophy of Science, actually, about the story and whether it could handle certain objections and whatnot. And I didn't send it out anymore until I could satisfy myself with respect to those objections, and I just didn't. Right? I thought that the referees had really found
some pretty strong objections.
Yeah, and I was in that situation where I could have said some things about it and probably made it go away.
Sure.
But they got me really worried, and so I stopped sending it out. And I haven't gotten back to it. I would say the style of philosophy I do now is so different from what I did at the time of my dissertation. I would tell you a different story now about what's going on when people engage in the kind of philosophy that I was doing for my dissertation, where they say things like, "Oh, well, I can tell you what causation really is."
Sure.
It's blah 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 definition kind of thing, right? And that's it. If I were to go back and write about causation now and defend it, I still buy the big story that I defended in my dissertation, but I'd be both working my way into it and conceiving of what I myself was doing and what contribution I was supposed to be making in a very different way now than I did then.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll see a book in the future. Maybe we'll see a self-reflective history or memoir, perhaps, and we see this the pragmatic account of causation comes out.
There's a little tiny version of it actually in an article on the units of selection that I published in Erkenntnis, because I needed machinery from the account to diagnose the problem that I thought was going on in the units of selection debate. And so it actually, a little thumbnail sketch of it has appeared in print, but it did so just in an Erkenntnis article on something else. Mm-hmm. And I think I even listed it with as the claim that this article, at least article length defense of the view, was forthcoming or in submission or something like that. And so people sometimes ask me which paper that is, and I have to red-facedly confess that it's never been.
That's right. You're like, it's a good idea though, but yeah. Okay, so you it sounds like you had a very successful run in graduate school. Now, let's move on. So you, I imagine, went on to the job market, and how did you find your way to landing the first? Was it the first job at UCI, or was this?
That's my first job. And I assume that some part of your audience is graduate students in philosophy. So
yeah, I imagine, some
detail here.
Mm-hmm.
So I was one of the people I was encouraged, and I think rightly, to take the 2 bites at the apple strategy. So I had a dissertation project in progress, but not in any danger of being finished.
Sure.
And but it was enough of it was done that people were already pretty excited about it. The people who were on my committee and advising me were already pretty enthusiastic about it.
Oh, that's great.
And so that year, even though I wasn't really ready, I applied for about 10 jobs, right?
Nice.
Just ones that, if you got it, you couldn't turn it down.
Sure, there's kind of shooting
find a way to make the dissertation shorter or something like that. So,
sure.
Right. So I interviewed with Harvard and Syracuse and
wow,
Columbia and I know I had really good I got a really good rate of interviews from those very fancy places, given my situation.
Sure. Yeah.
And what the short story is, what wound up happening, I went through all the parts of the job hunting process except for getting a job. Which was really immensely useful the next year because nothing was new and scary.
Well, getting all those interviews, that is just to get a number of interviews at those top high level places is substantial. I imagine maybe that year might have been pretty tough emotionally, or just having to. It sure was. But you're right that that was extremely encouraging, right? I felt, oh my gosh, I'm doing something right. The other thing, you don't hear this story too often, and it's something I would tell graduate students who are heading off the job market about. It was, even though it wasn't super pleasant or enjoyable, the dissertation project itself made huge leaps and strides because on the basis of talking about it with faculty at very fancy institutions. Oh, almost like kind of in process refereeing of.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the version of the story I went on to defend ultimately was very different from the one that I went out on the market with that first year, 1996.
Yeah. Well, I imagine had you just kind of stayed in this, insular community that is as interdisciplinary as it is, getting to talk to all those different people must have been. Yeah.
No, it was. It's one of the things that because of the circumstances at the time, we all think of job interviews as unreservedly negative.
Sure. Yeah.
I was.
That's a really great. Yeah. That's very optimistic, and that's a very strong. That's a great positive to take out of the
really
process.
Constructive in my case. It really helped me, take the next big step in the dissertation, and convinced me that I hadn't thought through. Right. We knew this a little bit going in because I was going on the job market early to just these places, but I appreciated much more viscerally how much more there was to figure out about how something like what I wanted to make work would make work.
Yeah.
So I had an on-campus interview at the University of Colorado. They were looking for an historian, and I did do a fair bit of history.
Did the history of modern philosophy
at the time. So I was very honest with them. Actually, I said, look here, I know all about these things and those things, but not these other things. And I think of myself primarily as a philosopher of science, but I am perfectly, enthusiastic and capable of being the historian you guys are trying to hire. And so, but they wound up not hiring me though. And that was crushing.
Sure.
But,
yeah.
I got the news while I was on my honeymoon.
Oh, geez. I'm sorry. Well, congratulations on the marriage. And yeah.
So I went out in a full dress way the following year, where I had a much better sense of, how my dissertation was, what the big story was.
Yep.
And so, I applied to 60 places or whatever the second year.
Oh, wow.
With the intention of getting a job, right?
Sure.
And so not just the fancy top places. And so I got a bunch of interviews and wound up going on small handful of on-campus visits.
Okay.
And though in fact, everything else had definitely not worked out by the time I got the job offer from UCI.
Wow.
Turns out that was fine because when I did the visits, I really loved the UCI people anyway, and we were enthusiastic about being able to stay in Southern California. And
did they have the logic and philosophy of science program going on at the time?
No,
they did
yet.
not. Oh,
no. This was just in the philosophy department.
Okay,
and it was certainly one of the jobs I was most interested in from the beginning, but it was also the last thing that could work out and did. The group that left to form the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science, the department wasn't formed until 2000, I believe, but the group that left to go found it, all that happened in 1998. So it was I'd only been on campus for a year, and that was awkward and difficult because the Logic and Philosophy of Science people were very enthusiastic about having me with them for obvious reasons, right? Given what I do.
Sure.
But I was also under a lot of pressure from the School of Humanities to stay in the philosophy department, and actually I wound up splitting my appointment between philosophy and logic and philosophy of science for 2 years.
Oh, okay.
Where I picked up the philosophy foot and went logic and philosophy of science full time.
So this was something that kind of you got there, and then it was kind of in the works.
This right. Split. Yeah. It was suddenly possible, and then it happened very fast, very quickly. But yeah, I had just gotten here and was still learning where the mailroom was.
Sure. Okay, so great. And so you started off, was that you said you've been there for about 20 years, so
right.
90, so around 96, 97. What do you say about that?
97, I think.
97. Great. So so what kinds of things were you working on that first couple of years?
Well, so as I think is true of many people when they first start their jobs, the needing to come up with to develop courses, I found absolutely overwhelming. Partly because I now think that I was more anxious about it and put more preparatory work into it than would have been strictly necessary, actually. But so in the very early years, I was kind of being moved around by what the department needed me to teach. But in the course of those years, when I was working on my intro philosophy of science course, was when, working back through stuff from people like Duhem, I thought, hey, people really haven't faced or noticed the version of the challenge to scientific realism that is most worth taking seriously. They're usually talking about these other things. But there in Duhem, there is this different line of concern than the one he's most famous for that seems to me to be the real, the most challenging version of the challenge. And so that ultimately became the thesis of my book.
Is this the alternative of the
unconceived alternatives? Yep.
Yeah.
And which is in Duhem. I mean, you'll find that out. You find that.
Yeah,
out.
I think I recall reading that. And maybe there was like the second reading of our philosophy of science graduate course. Duhem, talks about it, as well as from auxiliary hypotheses to these other alternatives.
Right. Could there be nothing else? Was Duhem's concern? Was Duhem's other concern? Right. Not just can you really rule this one out and therefore this one in.
But what about
So what are you not? Are these the only two possibilities? Right. I said those are really different concerns, and the second one is not something people are really worrying about. So, or not worried about, but I think it's the most important thing to be worried about. And so that sort of early on and through my teaching, not only that, but through my introductory teaching, I got started on what would become the research program of my early career.
So you found that teaching influenced your research?
Yeah, in just that way. And I hadn't crystallized the thought that was worth writing a book about until with and for my students, I started thinking really hard about what Duhem's challenge really was, and just saying, oh, you know what, there are actually two, and one everybody knows about and is famous, and this other one really not so much. Actually, he hadn't talked about Duhem, but Larry Sklar had written about it a little bit at the time. I just didn't know it until much later. Bob Batterman clued me in,
pointed you to, sure.
When he was quite young as well.
Great. How was the reception of the book?
Very good, and I think I have some lucky some strokes of luck to thank for that. The most important two are that the book was reviewed by Science.
Oh, wow.
Tim Lewins wrote the Science review, which was very complimentary. And so almost right away, it, was received a lot of attention, and lots of people bought it, and had a lot of success early on. I think, how often does Science pick up a philosophy of science book? That's really something. I was surprised. They do them. I've seen.
Yeah, definitely.
But it is kind of rare, and I really don't know by what process the Science decided to commission a review of it. If I were guessing, I would think that Oxford University Press probably had something to do with at least giving them the opportunity, at least trying to catch somebody's eye.
Sure.
But that process actually is one I don't know anything about. I heard from Tim that he was reviewing it, and when he wanted me to take a look at the review. So those were a couple strokes of luck that really increased the splash or the footprint that the book made when it first came out.
Sure. And how do you like? I'm curious as a aspiring philosopher of science myself. What do you like about works in book form as opposed to articles?
Well, I always find articles. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. What's nice about a book, in contrast to articles,
sure,
is that you have a chance to make a really robust, systematic, full-blooded case for whatever it is you think people should believe. People will encourage you not to try writing a book too early in your career, and I think that's good advice because,
sure,
you can't. In a way, it's chancy, right? To see if it works out. But what I wound up doing was writing a bunch of articles that would naturally be chapters in a book, sort of like I'd done with the dissertation. And so, I really liked making a self-contained case where I said, here's everything that needs to be said about that. You're worried about this problem? Here, we'll talk about that in this chapter. You're worried about the motivation for assuming this or that? Well, we'll talk about it here in this early chapter. And so that I think is the nice feature of it. You have the room to answer all the problems and do all of the motivating and setting up kind of work that you care to.
Yep.
And there is a way to start working on that even while you're just publishing articles.
Yeah, no, I think that's something I hadn't really thought about. I've heard of turning your articles into kind of a book, but never put like that. So that's really great. So why don't you bring us up to speed? I know you have a very, just for time constraints, I'd love to hear more about, what it is you're doing, but what kinds of projects are you working on now?
Well, one that I thought might be of interest to you or in this connection, because it's kind of an outgrowth of the unconceived alternatives thing. And speaks to the, challenges facing science kind of stuff, is a line of argument. So one of the most interesting things, one of the most interesting lines of response I got from the book was, not conceiving of well-confirmed alternative theories. I can see how that might have been a problem for scientific communities of the past. but things are so much better now, right? Our scientific communities are so much bigger and better organized and faster. And,
so the assumption
whatever,
might go.
right? And so I thought, well, so my first thought was, that's not convincing at all, because essentially because people in the past were in a position to say exactly the same thing.
Sure.
But it did strike me as a really interesting question. Like, is that true? Should you think that this part of the argument of the book was this unconceived alternatives business is not always a problem in any scientific context or any context of theorizing. And so, how would you decide if this was a problem that's gotten better over time or worse over time or whatever? And so for a while there, I was giving talks, and I wound up publishing a paper mostly on this, in which I suggested that, and this was really an interesting experience for me because I hadn't had this thought before. I came to it working through the how would you answer a question like that stuff. But the thought was, look, if you look at the big historical developments across the history of modern science anyway, so here, and I elaborate in some detail, these are transformations like science becoming no longer an activity of sort of independently wealthy or supported gentlemen scholars who were doing this to cultivate their intellect, and moving there in the very early part of the 19th century, 20th century to professionalized academic communities.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a 19th century phenomenon. So that transition, also the transition to essentially publicly funded science of the NSF model type, where scientists request, right, essentially you need money to do science these days, and scientists request money to do particular investigations or to pursue particular projects that, a council of graybeards sits around and decides in advance whether this is a promising thing to do or not, a promising investment of resources. And then the transition also to big science in the kind of late middle of the 20th century. All of those, I suggested, were things that made the problem or the concern about unconceived alternatives worse rather than better, because they were all changes in the scientific enterprise itself that made that would naturally have the effect of making it more intellectually and theoretically conservative, right? So it's one thing if you have a wild hair and everybody else thinks you're, that's never going to work.
Right. You
can still go do it, right? Once you're a professional, you have to think about what other people think about your research, because it's how you're living. Once you're in the NSF format, you have to worry about getting a group of people who are already steeped in the theoretical orthodoxy of the present day to think that exploring your crazy thing is a good idea, and all the more so when scientific resources are handed out to big, complicated groups than individual investigators. And so I wound up arguing there that, look, we have at least as much reason to think that the problem of unconceived alternatives is worse now rather than better, because of the changes some of the changes we've seen in scientific communities and the enterprise of science over time. So I still see that as I write on a number of things growing out of the unconceived alternatives business, but that's one where I really think of there being, it's not that nobody worries about the problem. The science policy folks are worried about, is peer review the best system for distributing resources and stuff like that? All right. The worry's been around, but there's an historical dimension to this that I think is really not appreciated. And if you're convinced by the historical argument, it does start to be concerning whether contemporary science is really still capable of or still likely to generate the kinds of, truly foundational theoretical transformations that we've had in the past. I think it is, but I think we've made it systematically harder and harder over the course of for many good reasons, right? Science is much more expensive than it used to be, and all kinds of other stuff, right? And we want professionals and not amateurs and stuff like that. But but nonetheless, those changes, those big changes, which were certainly have good effects and were motivated in a good way, I think have also made this problem worse.
Well, that's a very fascinating insight. Do you have any particular articles that you might be able to point us to, or anything that you've written lately?
Sure. So the argument about that takes place most extensively in an article that I published in Synthese, and I will have to go peek at what the name of it is, because...
We could probably Google Scholar that.
Yeah, but it's very easy for me. Let me just check.
Okay.
Also, if I remember it has some very long title. So let's go look. Okay. So this is called, Synthese, 2015. It's called Unconceived Alternatives and Conservatism in Science,
Very nice.
The Impact of Professionalization, Peer Review, and Big Science.
Okay, very nice, very nice.
But so this is disjoint with the rest of what our conversation has been about. So it might not be
sure. No, it's interesting. Well, it definitely comes to see what in particular that just to see the evolution of your ideas and your kinds of work that you're interested in.
It's nice to see what grows out. Okay, so you have a big idea, and then how do things grow out of that?
Yeah.
The thing that I'm investing the most time in these days has nothing to do with any of that. It's this.
Tell me. Yeah.
I'm essentially have advocated and I'm defending a story about the evolution of human moral psychology.
Oh yeah, I noticed on the page that you were getting into moral psychology. Yeah, tell me more about that.
So that is. So this is new for me. It's part of why it's taken me some time to get up to. I haven't published anything on this yet. Well, except book reviews of books in the area and stuff like that. But I'm still working on getting out despite many talks, the article where I'm mostly putting this forward. But the idea is really an idea about both why existing suggestions about the selective advantages of having a moral psychology or having one that works the way ours does, are not adequate. Right? Do not answer the question that really needs to be asked. And I have but I suggest that question can be asked. Or can be answered based on a bunch of findings I draw from primatology and developmental psychology and places like that. You don't care what it is, but the idea is to advance a story about, in evolutionary terms, why human beings have the moral psychology that they do and why it works in particular ways.
Why we have a particular, okay. But this is fascinating. So this is something in particular the podcast does is look at philosophers of science who are engaged in the sciences themselves. So does this, how are you approaching this project? Is this something where you're reading examples in primatology? Are you speaking with scientists? Are you going off your own kind of the case histories from familiar or finding those in previous suggestions that have already been brought up?
I am. I've talked to a fair number of scientists about this thing, and I got interested in it in part because philosophy of biology students, I was doing reading groups with philosophy of biology students, a lot of game theory students around UC Irvine.
Yeah.
They want to know philosophy of biology too, which makes perfect sense. And so I was doing philosophy of biology reading groups with them, and we started reading some primatology that really got me thinking about it. And the challenge is really well posed in a pretty well known book of Richard Joyce's. called something like The Evolution of Morality, where he says, look, here you guys can explain all this other stuff, but here's what you really need to know, or what the real puzzle is. And so starting to get in, I taught a series of seminars in evolution of X, where X is some cognition, language, morality, whatnot.
Sure.
Was the combination of that kind of primatology, developmental psychology stuff, and the readings for those seminars that made me really start thinking about this a lot. I guess, if you're looking for it for the podcast, until very recently, this has been the work of mine that most directly engages and interfaces with contemporary science. Just earlier this year, though, I published a paper together with two colleagues from UCI's Cognitive Science Department, and that's probably the most scientific work I've done. It's a paper in experimental psychology.
Oh, wow.
Called "No Child Left Alone."
I saw an image of a child at a poker table or something on your and I was like, oh, okay, cool. That looks like a fun and clever title.
Well, the paper itself has attracted quite a bit of attention in the couple of months since it came out, because it's on a subject that is of pretty wide popular interest. Right? What we essentially do in that paper is start with this puzzle, right? Everybody knows you can't leave children on their own, but of course, until very recently, we did that all the time, right? This was the standard parenting of just a generation ago. So, what's responsible for that? And so, the study itself shows. So, our hypothesis was that when people judge risks to children left alone, they're very much influenced by their moral attitudes about the parents of the children leaving them alone. And so we did a study where children were, there was these little vignettes, and in the vignettes, children were being left alone in exactly the same circumstances for exactly the same amount of time, at exactly the same age, and all this stuff. The only thing that varied between the scenarios was the parent's reason for leaving the child alone. And so, it could be, unintentional. She was hit by a car when she, went around the back to go up to her seat, and nobody knew there was a baby in the car. She left a child alone for this amount of time and this amount of these circumstances. To work or to go conduct an affair with a lover. And intriguingly enough, right, in exactly the same circumstances, people think that children are significantly more danger if they disapprove of the parent's reason. So people think that children left alone by accident are in the least amount of danger. Mm-hmm. Children left alone on purpose are in significantly more danger. And if you leave a child alone in order to go have an affair, that child's in much,
That's so funny how I immediately went, oh, that's wrong. They shouldn't do that. That child is in grave danger. No, that's interesting.
We think there's a general phenomenon here, which is essentially the adjustment of factual beliefs about the world to better support or rationalize moral judgments. Mm-hmm. And that in essence, a nuclear strength version of this effect has created a feedback loop that's changed social mores in just a single generation, right? The feedback loop, if you have a strong moral reaction because the person's violating a norm, right? Then you elevate the amount of danger you think the child is in to better justify your moral outrage. But that higher estimate of danger leads to even more moral outrage, requiring even higher judgments of danger, and so on, back and forth. So the two things push each other.
Yeah. Wow. No, this is fascinating. And I just pulled up the study here, or the sub. Do you run multiple studies? It looks like, or just
there's one article, but there were 6 studies. That were all part of it, and it's available for free to anybody. One of the reasons we placed it where we did in this journal Calabra is it's the University of California's open access journal.
Oh, wow.
And so we thought this would probably get some notice. I mean, we've been very surprised by how much attention it's gotten, but we thought this might get some attention outside of just academics, and so we thought it would be a good way to help the open access kind of project by putting it in a thing that's really just getting started. UC's open access journal is really just getting started.
Yeah, I feel like there's also this kind of fear of sometimes open access journals as being so it's really good to see ones like I hadn't heard about UC Press, but Calabra sounds like a great great concept.
2, I think, and we just published this last August. So it's,
okay.
Really very new. And I should confess, it wasn't that this was our only consideration, right? We sent the study, and earlier not as good version of the paper to Science and Nature, and
sure, you gotta go big, and
then we got to thinking about it, and open access has become an issue that's very important to one of my co-authors, and so it seemed like a natural thing to try, and it's worked out well.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm looking forward. No, I'm very interested in this, and I have quite a few fellow colleagues interested in moral psychology. We have someone, John Krushke. I don't know if he's necessarily interested in evolution of it, but he certainly runs a number of different studies. You ever gone to the Society for Philosophy and Psychology meeting by chance, the SPP?
No. I know that people speak highly of it, but I haven't had the chance.
Yeah, I happened to go this year. It was very good. I feel like moral psychology is a really big theme in it, so it certainly would be very nice. It's a good good place for that kind of work. I think going on that merges some philosophical thinking, but also relates with some empirical work.
And it's nice to have a chance to engage. I mean, this has forced me to learn all kinds of stuff about ethics and metaethics, and in addition to the primatology and developmental psychology and stuff. And so it's been nice to go around and give talks on the evolutionary thing, and have ethicists, right, other people who have serious interests in moral psychology that are not motivated in the same way mine are. Yeah,
there's like there's from the philosophy background, like morals.
Right. They're often the ethicists are expecting me to come in and say, science tells us what to think about ethics, and here's what it is. And I think I've had many experiences with people being pleasantly surprised that a big part of what I'm doing is worrying about how serious the explanatory burdens on an evolutionary account of or explanation for human moral psychology is, and why science hasn't yet met them. Of course, I come in and save the day, but nonetheless, right? They're usually
well. If you can say, and science has not yet met them, that's going to be a positive for maybe for philosophers. But if we're like +1 for philosophy, okay.
The thing that's fair about that reaction, I think, is what usually surprises people is how much of the project is trying to make clear why a distinctive philosophical kind of question isn't answered by any of the empirical stuff we yet have from science. And so I think in many cases it's just taking philosophical concerns and worries so seriously that I think the ethicists are cheered by, right?
Yeah. Well, it seems like some great work, and I'm really excited to see what comes of it. I imagine, are there more empirical studies in the works, or
we're extending the No Child Left Alone stuff in a couple of different ways. But the one that's most exciting to me is I'm trying to find other domains where the same thing happens, where we adjust our factual beliefs to better justify or rationalize our moral attitudes. And so there are actually a number of different, chains of follow-up studies in the works, right? Like, so does race differences make a difference and stuff like that, right? But the finding, I think there's a general phenomenon here, and finding other instances of it is the one I'm most excited about.
Sure. So we began this podcast, and we had this through line of you discussing some motivation to do public service in some way. First, it was legal, and then kind of making peace with that in academia. I'm curious of how are you going about today doing for in a broad sense public service in the philosophy of science?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say I think about it much differently than I did back in the day, and I would say two things, I guess. One is I no longer think of anybody's professional ambition as becoming Aristotle or whatever, right? I now know more about.
I think there are still some people who are trying to become Aristotle, but I
think so. But one of the obstacles I didn't appreciate at the time is how much everything else in the world has changed, such that you can't just. It's not a matter of being so smart or so much smarter than other people that that your name lasts forever like Aristotle.
Sure.
It's just not the way it works anymore. But I've been encouraged, I think, by finding many smaller ways in which the academic work I do makes a difference to people, right? And so this, it's one reason. So I'll just, since I've already talked about it, I'll use this example, right?
Sure, yeah.
The fact that the unconceived alternative story extended in the way that I talked about has implications for science policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
How we should be funding or supporting scientific work. And so that's just an example, but it's an example of, it's no accident. I think I've been drawn to issues that have an practical upshot or significance, in part because I want the work that I do to make a difference.
Yeah,
but the other way in which I've been reassured is just watching the impact you can have on students. And it doesn't, I used to think of how that, the successful version of that is making a student fall in love with philosophy. And I really don't think of it that way anymore. Yeah. I think that what you can do is teach people to think clearly and carefully about difficult questions. And I will view myself as having, performed an invaluable public service if I just have students coming out of my courses better able to do that.
Yeah.
And it affects the sort of the design of my undergraduate courses, what I'm trying to do. But I think I'm now right. I'm excited all over again about the chance to have a positive impact on people's lives through teaching. But I have a very different picture of what accomplishes that.
Well, I think what you're describing to me, I really like it in the courses that I've had the opportunity to teach in focusing on definitely getting into the skills with which you would like to teach, like where it's more skill based. Mm-hmm. Given that to think critically and carefully are essentially the skills that you would hope them to take, rather than a particular emotional reaction, for example, as a goal. Right. That would be nice too. But I think you're right in that the
trick is how you get them to think clearly and carefully. And that part involves an emotional response too.
Sure.
You've got to either be talking about questions they already care about and think are important, or in a different kind of class, motivating or getting them to care about kinds of questions that you're worried about in a philosophy course. And I think I'm able to do that quite well. And so the students have to buy in order for you to actually teach them how to think any more clearly and carefully than they already do. But there are ways to accomplish that I think I'm still learning over time.
I'm excited. So has it come a long way since your was it maybe fourth or fifth year first class to now, I guess, teaching 20 years?
Yeah, I would say it has. I haven't sat around much and thought about just how. I think, in some ways it's also noteworthy things that haven't changed, right? I have my whole life run a very informal classroom where I really try to make sure people are feel free to make mistakes or raise points that they haven't fully thought out, all
I
the
think
way.
that's so important. Yeah.
And so, those things haven't changed, but my appreciation of what I want students to walk away with and how to get them to walk away with that, I think has come a long way.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it seems like, we've learned a lot and we've covered a lot of ground. And is there anything, Kyle, that you would like to say or, any other, plugs or messages out to any of the listeners out here you'd like to know about UC Irvine, about philosophy of science, anything of that sort?
Well, if you're interested in graduate school in philosophy of science, I don't think there's much danger you're not going to notice Irvine's program. So
it's probably going to come up on maybe the first page of Google, but you never know. Yeah. Okay.
But I certainly encourage those with we're nice in some ways because this is worth saying, because we're a small and specialized program, and because we are like programs like maybe history and philosophy of science programs too, we attract a lot of students who don't have traditional philosophical backgrounds, right? They might have really strong background in physics or mathematics or something like that, but they discovered late in their college careers that there even was such a thing as philosophy of physics or philosophy of psychology, and they were all excited about it. And so I would maybe especially shout out there to students who are really interested in philosophy of science, but feel like they are disadvantaged by having a non-traditional background. The students who don't have a philosophy degree, but show all the right signs of being able to do the stuff. Those are the kinds of students that programs like ours love to take to admit and
very smart, bright students who can continue to learn and develop their skills.
Have to have an undergraduate degree in philosophy in order to go to graduate school in philosophy, at least in the kind of program that we've got.
Okay. Well, Kyle, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you coming and staying a little bit longer than expected, but I thought we had some really good conversation. And
no problem. I enjoyed it immensely, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Well, take care. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon in sunny, or I suppose rainy, Southern California. And if you ever come into Indiana, please do say hello.
I certainly will.
All right. Take care, Kyle.
Thanks a lot.